Hello, my name is Courtney Hillhouse. Welcome back to an episode of A Closer Look. I'm joined today with Claire Swanson, the filmmaker of the LGBTQ Perspectives Project and Community Connections. Today we're going to talk about media representation. So thank you for joining me, Claire.
Oh, you're welcome. It's really great to be here again. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about this.
So first question, Fabio discusses the importance of media representation and not feeling alone. He also brings up the importance of seeing queer brown stories. And Nathaniel says that publishing isn't caught up to where the kids are. And Tiffany highlights queer youth creating their own content to deal with the vacuum in mainstream media. Do you see the pendulum shifting to catch up with this?
First of all, I'm really glad that you highlighted Tiffany mentioning queer youth creating their own content, because I think she made a really great point about how the best queer youth stories come from queer youth themselves. But one reason we really see this vacuum in mainstream media is that, queer and trans people of color, a lot of these marginalized writers and marginalized directors aren't getting the platform in mainstream media, and these pilots of queer brown stories are often not becoming shows, and white straight narratives are so often seen as the default, and people really tell their own stories best. Another one of our interviewees, Hannah, actually mentioned the idea of bringing people to the proverbial table, the idea that sort of these companies that are primarily these media companies that are primarily run by white straight men, and a lot of times it's not even a proverbial table, it's a real table, and they have a lot of the control in this industry, and they're talking about bringing in marginalized voices as if the table belongs to them. And as Hannah said really eloquently, you don't own the table, like this space isn't yours. And I think although we're getting a lot of really great content, things like Love Victor and Pose that some of our interviewees mentioned, what we really need is a culture shift. And not just these shows coming in that are really good stories, but really a shift in the culture that's so centered on white narratives, straight narratives, male-centric narratives. It's the culture that's a really big part of it, the culture in the film and TV industry.
That's a great point. So next question, Fabio makes a statement about queer and trans culture being erased. Do you think there's any hope with change in federal administrations that this dynamic will shift or change?
I would say that there is hope, but I also think that a lot of activism needs to be done outside what the government is doing. A lot of the major victories for our community, even if they did end up being written into statute, were driven by our own activism, the activism of our community, and the shifts in community and perception. And I'd also like to bring up that a lot of these victories were specifically driven by queer and trans people of color, which is often erased. And if we can come together and keep that same energy that we've had at the times that there have been administrations actively committed to erasure, I do believe that there is hope, and I do believe that we can see productive change, but we can't sort of relax now that we have a less actively bigoted administration. Activism from our community is still going to be so important.
So what are the queer storylines that we need? What makes representation positive? And what should people look for when picking out something to watch or to share with their kids or students?
I'm glad you asked what makes representation positive, because we use the term positive representation a lot, and it is important to clarify what that is. So a lot of factors brought up in the interviews that occur in mainstream queer stories that may not be quite so positive is the struggle arc. Most queer stories in mainstream media are about an LGBTQ person who is really struggling. They're not accepted. They're not accepting themselves. They're experiencing violence. And while it's not an inherently bad thing to show people struggling because of discrimination, these really shouldn't be the only stories that are out there, especially for youth and especially for little kids. It can be really harmful to young people when they're not able to imagine a positive future for themselves in media. You know, we need more stories about queer people who are able to be happy. And no one is happy all the time. But Kendra, another of our interviewees, talked about queer people getting to be joyous. Seeing characters like us experiencing joy is really important, because when you're a queer youth who is struggling, you're not really experiencing joy, and all the media you're consuming is showing that people with your identity don't get to experience joy. That's pretty unhelpful. So I think stories that are more complex, that allow queer people to show the full range of emotion that we have as human beings, which includes sadness and anger and shame, but it includes happiness, and that's what's missing. It includes happiness, joy, excitement, and we really need more of that. Another theme that came up in a lot of interviews is the idea of having one single queer character whose only storyline is that they're queer. This kind of tokenization is harmful. It's more realistic and more helpful to the audience for these characters to be well-rounded, having likes, dislikes, goals, ambitions, things every character has, and being able to have these interesting storylines that aren't necessarily grounded in their sexuality. Something that Tiffany brought up is that this queerness is part of who they are. Their story is infused with queerness, but it's not the entire storyline. That's not an exact quote, and definitely she said it better, but I just wanted to bring that up because I thought she made a great point.
No, absolutely. So many great points were made in this episode. So I want to thank you, Claire, for joining me, and thank you for joining us for another episode of A Closer Look. For more information on this video series, visit greenpeakalliance.org and visit the media tab.